Hey, party people, it's me again, the man of regret. The audio in this episode borked out again. It's hard to catch mishaps on the audio recorder when you're a one-man show, so a couple minutes in, my good mic goes out. I apologize once again. Hopefully we'll be back to business next week. Hey everybody, welcome back to AURAM'S FORUM. So today, we have an interesting-ish topic. It's another heavily comic book centric topic. I feel like we've been talking about lots of movie stuff lately. Honestly, I record these once a week and sometimes I forget what I say, so I know last time I cursed a lot and that video hasn't gone up at the time of this recording, so either everyone's real on board or like my channel's up in flames, but I don't know. Today we're talking about the importance of not having event books, and what that means is a multitude of things. I guess I should explain what an event book is right off the bat. An event comic book is normally something that Marvel, DC, or a company that has a largely shared universe puts out that is generally a huge crossover between all their properties, all their characters, to do something or other or face a threat that's never been seen before. But sometimes those go awry and event books just don't work out that well. If you want some examples of some event books, at least recently, at the time of this recording, Secret Empire is happening. That's a nice event book. It's just a big old time, big status quo change in the Marvel universe that it's a crossover between everybody. Everybody's figuring out Cap's Hydra, Hydra America, all this stuff. On DC's side, you got, well, DC Rebirth is not really an event. They don't really have an event going on right now, which is good, which I'll get into in a little bit. But most of the time, whenever a crisis happens, like, I don't know, Final Crisis, 0 Hour, Crisis on Infinite Earths, famously, Flashpoint, their events are more so referred to as crises. They do have smaller events, but, like Blackest Night could be considered an event. I'm pretty sure it is an event, but it's not a crisis, I don't think. That's a whole another video that I actually am planning on doing, talking about DC crises and their whole thing. But more examples of Marvel events: Civil War, House of M, stuff like that. Avengers vs. X-Men, just big crossover things that have like a huge cast of characters normally, and they're dealing with some kind of new threat or some kind of something. And the importance of not having them, there's a multitude of reasons for it. We'll start with the first one, which is a lot of the time Marvel events, especially lately, they kind of change everything in people's solo titles, and that's not okay a lot of the time. I used to be like a supporter in this idea where an event happens, and as long as Marvel gives their creators enough time to plan for it, it's fine. You can wrap up your story and everything, but what if your creator doesn't want to tie into that event? What if they just want to keep telling their story? So that's kind of an issue that I have with event books, where a good example is Silk. I remember with Silk, well, this is actually kind of a bad example because they tied in pretty well, but it was also pretty abrupt. So, spoilers for Silk Volume 1, I guess. Before Secret Wars, when the entire universe was destroyed and Dr. Doom tried to save it, well, he did save it, but he like kind of, I don't know, it's beside the point. Silk was just doing her story, doing her thing. She was trying to find her family at the time, and there was the series of tie-ins to Secret Wars leading up to Secret Wars called the Last Days tie-ins. And they were essentially just the last couple days on Earth before the universe was destroyed by the final incursion. And normally it just kind of, every one of the Last Days books kind of just ended in the big explosion that killed everyone. And in Silk, the big explosion that killed everyone happened literally right when she found her brother and met up with her brother. And it's honestly, this is why I said it was kind of a good thing. It was a really heartbreaking, touching moment that probably would not have happened without Secret Wars. Because I think it still would have been a very touching moment, her finally finding her brother, but it was just incredibly bizarre and heartbreaking, because like I knew that it was a Last Days tie-in, but reading that, it just happened so quickly. Like, she finds out where her brother is, and then the next 2 pages, I'm pretty sure, she is, in like 1 page, she's on her way to go find him, and then the next page she finds him, boom, Secret Wars happens. Easy peasy. Dead Silk. Dead in the ground. And good thing, bad thing. Bad thing because, honestly, a couple months pass, Secret Wars ends, the timeline is set back to before the incursions happen, and Silk just picks up where they left off, because they do the 8-month time jump to compensate for that time at the start of Avengers Volume, I think, 5, at the start of Hickman's Avengers to the start of All New, All Different Marvel, or the end of Secret Wars, essentially. That's that 8-month time gap. And Silk, the book just kind of goes back to normal, and there's just this weird, like, I think they call it Volume 0 of Silk now. They do the same thing with Spider-Gwen. And then there's Volume 1, which starts after Secret Wars, which picks up with her finding her brother again, or I'm pretty sure it just picks up at that moment, before she was incinerated by the fiery flames of Earth 1610 and Earth 616 colliding in a beautiful mess. But, I don't know. I honestly think that events that stop books from continuing are a little bit annoying, and there's a pretty easy solution to something like that, where you just let those books continue and say that they take place a couple weeks or a couple months before the event happens, and then maybe you can naturally tie into it later, or just in your next story arc, set that next story arc after the event. And if it doesn't pertain to your story at all, don't mention it. If it does, mention it a little bit. But that's kind of something that Matt Fraction's Invincible Iron Man did for a couple events. There were events that they tied into. Dark Reign specifically was a huge event that Invincible Iron Man tied into. There's a whole trade for it that is confusing if you're trying to read Invincible Iron Man, because there's just like this gap that you have to go find the Dark Reign trade for. That's beside the point. But there are also some times where Iron Man wasn't directly involved in an event, or it wasn't super important or pertinent to him, and he just kind of mentioned that it happened. Like Dark Reign was when Norman Osborn was leading Hammer, and that his whole Dark Reign tie-ins, there were 2 volumes of Dark Reign tie-ins of Norman Osborn coming after Tony Stark, because Tony Stark downloaded the Superhuman Registration Act list, the registrar of everyone's secret identities, into his brain and deleted it, and so his brain was the only copy. And he's running around deleting his brain and going brain dead in the process of Norman Osborn tracking him down across the world. And it's actually, I've heard that people don't enjoy that book that much, but it's one of my favorite parts of Matt Fraction's Invincible Iron Man. Such an interesting story. And a good tie-in to an event, because it doesn't stop the story in any way. It's just a new story arc that happens to kind of loosely tie into Dark Reign, or is a result of Dark Reign being a thing. And Dark Reign is kind of, it was just kind of a status quo event, like the Heroic Age, which happened right before Avengers vs. X-Men, stuff like that. Marvel Now and All New, All Different Marvel and those types of titles can somewhat be considered that. DC Rebirth is a good example of that, where something just kind of, a book kicks it off, and then all titles from that point on until another thing like this happens are considered Rebirth books or Dark Reign books, even if they're not super directly tying into it. Rebirth is a better example of that, because Rebirth just kind of happened with the Rebirth #1, and then every book now is a Rebirth book, but it's just happening during the Rebirth period of DC. But I'm kind of getting off track here. So, another problem that I have with event books being a thing, and I talked about this a lot a couple episodes ago in the extreme marketing episode, is just that. They're extreme marketed, where, for those that didn't see that episode, go check it out. But essentially what I'm talking about with that idea of extreme marketing is that every single event book is marketed as the end of the universe, no matter what. Like, you've never seen this before, and that just gets bothersome. I don't want to regurgitate what I said in that video, but it's just irritating. So when event books are happening this consistently, and the end of the universe is happening every couple months, and this kind of leads into my next point, your heroes never get a chance to decompress, and they never get a chance to take time for themselves, or in a larger sense, your writers never get time to tell their own stories. Sure, they're telling their stories in the context of an event, but they're telling their stories as influenced by another writer's stories. They're not having full creative control. Like, if some guy came along, if I came along and was like, I want to write an Iron Man story about him creating a new suit of armor on Earth, and he uses it to bathe puppies, but Secret Wars is happening, I can't write that story, because Secret Wars has literally changed the fabric of the entire Marvel multiverse. So there's no room for that story. And yeah, you could make the solution where continuity shouldn't matter, and you could just tell whatever story you want anywhere, anytime, and that's fair, but that just gets confusing when you have a shared universe. I talked about this on the first episode of AURAM'S Forum at great length, but it's just, in the case of Silk, again, she's again kind of a good example of doing this, where since she's a smaller character, any event that was happening she wasn't super tied into, and Secret Wars was kind of the only huge super event that was going on around her, like, inception, so that was kind of the one that she was super tied into. Nothing huge has happened since. Civil War II, she was nowhere to be seen, and I don't think she had any tie-ins into it. Clone Conspiracy, she did have a tie-in or two, but that was a little bit abrupt, but she's part of that whole universe, so regardless. And I'll talk about, like, in-universe, like, small universe events in a bit, but I do think it's a huge problem when you look at, say, like a list of 10 comics in a volume, and over half of them have tie-in in the cover or something to Civil War II or Secret Wars or Blackest Night or whatever. It's just, it presents a problem where your writers either have to tell very short stories, or they're just telling supplementary stories to other people's events. And if that's what you want to do, more power to you. But I just personally like it when my characters get to be developed and play in their own little sandbox for a while before having to tie into an event. Or even if an event is happening, just leave their solo book alone and create, if another writer does want to tell a story with that same character, but during the event, have that writer, or have the same writer, who cares, make a new book that is specifically a tie-in to the event. And Marvel is starting to realize that that's how you should do it, and that's kind of what they've been doing going forward, because I know with the most recent event, Monsters Unleashed, any tie-ins that they had were not part of the main series of books. They were all like, I'll take Champions for example. It wasn't Champions number 6 was the event tie-in, it was Champions number 1.mu for Monsters Unleashed. And that was actually, speaking a little bit about the Champions tie-in, Mark Waid did that beautifully. I think it's Mark Waid that's writing Champions. Because he took that opportunity as a chance to loosely tie into Monsters Unleashed in the sense that they're just fighting one of the kaiju, and then also introduce or set up the next story arc for Champions by introducing the freelancers. And that was just a great tie-in. It was self-contained if you wanted it to be, but it also set up the next arc if you were interested in reading that. It's just a great example of a good way to do a tie-in to an event. It didn't disrupt the story at all because it was outside of the main numbering, and it didn't, it wasn't super necessary to read for the main story either. So, good job, Marvel, for doing that. Secret Empire, which is happening right now, seems to have gone backwards a bit to the old way of doing it, where just solo books tie into it. They are also creating new titles that start as tie-ins, like Secret Warriors, and that one will probably end as a tie-in. And they're also creating like mini-series for the event as well, I believe. But they're also tying in with other books, so I don't understand the mix-mash crazy grab that's going on. It also just makes it confusing because there's no Secret Empire thing in the name. And at least for me, personally, if I want to read all the tie-ins to an event and I see a tie-in that's like number 7 of Deadpool or something, I don't want to go read that because, in my personal opinion, I have a hard time reading a book not starting at number 1, which is a crazy mentality to have with comics, but especially with Marvel when number 1s are so accessible nowadays. Their jumping on points are so accessible nowadays. But it's weird for me to jump into a book just to read a tie-in if it's part of a larger series. Now, if they did like Secret Empire : Deadpool or something, and it was just like 1 through 3, easy peasy, read that. I recently looked at the entire catalog of Flashpoint, and they kind of had to do the miniseries route for tie-ins because Flashpoint created an alternate timeline, so they couldn't really tie in other books in that way. They could have, but it would have been confusing, so I'm glad they didn't. But yeah, like I said, all the Flashpoint tie-ins are just miniseries of three comics, 3 issues that give more richness and focus on specific parts of the Flashpoint universe that is not dived into in the main Flashpoint book, which is also how tie-ins should be, giving more info on what's going on. The original Civil War had some of these. They had prelude books, they had aftermath books, and they had books going on in the middle that were all just miniseries that were created. And I've heard, I haven't read a lot of them, but I've heard a lot of them are very good. So events are kind of all over the place in that capacity, but they just, I guess I could kind of wrap up here by saying just a quick summary of my thoughts again. Event books are they're disruptive at the end of the day if they're happening too often. And I'm not saying that event books are bad, they happen too often, especially in Marvel Comics nowadays. And when they do happen, they disrupt other books, and the stories that writers are telling feel kind of bottlenecked, just waiting for the event to stop so that people can pick it up again. And that's also just bad for sales, because if an event happens and you're not interested in that event, and every book that you were reading is now tying into that event, you're not going to want to read those books. For example, that happened to me. When Monster Mayhem happened, I think that's what it's called, not Monsters Unleashed, Monster Mayhem, the Batman event. It was a Bat Family event. The only Batman books that I were reading were Batgirl and Batman, and Batman tied into it for 2 issues, Tom King's Batman, 2 issues. I dropped it for those 2 issues. Haven't read those. It might have been just 1, but I don't remember. I dropped those because I wasn't reading the rest of the titles, so I didn't know what was going on, so I didn't care. So, at least taking that anecdotal evidence, sales dropped. So, I don't know. I picked it back up again when I Am Suicide started after that, and it did not matter to me. Like, those books did not matter. And I'm sure you could say the same about any other small crossover event, like The Button that just happened at the time of this recording. If I wasn't reading The Flash, I would probably be confused. But I was reading The Flash, so I read the 4 issues of The Button, and it was fantastic. But that was also very well done because not a lot of what was happening in The Flash before the Button stuff was important, and the same goes for Batman. It was more just like a DC Rebirth event. And I could talk more about event books in general, but at the end of the day, at least for the importance of event books not happening, I would just say that they're disruptive and they just cause chaos, and I think it would be better if writers were able to tell all the stories that they wanted, no matter what. They just went with it, and if they wanted to tie into an event book, they could, but preferably they would put it in its own miniseries instead of making the numbering system weird. It's also weird for trades. And I remember I was reading a Justice League trade once, and it had like 2 issues of a larger DC event, and they didn't include the rest, so I was just, that whole trade, that whole like $12, $15, $20 thing that I was reading had maybe one issue that was pertinent to the rest of the series I had read, and then like maybe a one-shot that was a tie-in to a different event, and then 2 issues that were part of a larger crossover event that I didn't know was happening. I think it was the Trinity War trade. And I didn't know what the hell was going on, because it wasn't, I didn't see the beginning, I didn't see the middle, I didn't see the end. I just saw these weird parts. I guess I did kind of see the middle, but I didn't know how it started or how it ended. It just kind of happened, and I felt like I wasted 20 bucks. So, event books are disruptive. I'm gonna end this here. Those are my thoughts. Thanks to now Andrew and Julie for editing this one. I don't know what they're doing. I was just informed that they're both editing these now, so both your Twitters here, I guess. And then my Twitter just like, whoop, right tiny. Check all of us out on the Twitter. Continue conversation over there, or down in the comments. What do you guys think about event books happening? Are they too disruptive? Do you like DC's model of doing a big event kind of every couple of years at this point, and with small crossovers between books in the meantime? Or do you like Marvel's model of events where they happen literally every summer, and at this point, it's kind of twice a year? This year so far we've had Monsters Unleashed and Secret Empire, with probably a Marvel Legacy event in the fall. Last year we had Secret Wars, Civil War II, and Avengers Standoff, which Avengers Standoff is incredible, by the way. It's an example of a small, self-contained crossover event that was just great. But Secret Wars and Civil War II were the big boy crossover battle boys. Or was Secret Wars 2015? I don't know. Who gives a flying flark? Anyway, thanks for watching. Do all the things I said earlier. Let's talk about it down below. Am I an idiot? Who knows? Is my channel burning down to the ground? Probably. I'll see you next week for something else.